The dust of Dusthaven was a living thing. It was born in the parched arroyos and sun-scorched flats of the New Mexico territory, carried on a wind that promised no rain, and settled into the very soul of the town. It coated the unpainted planks of the church, seeped through the walls of the saloon, and clung to the sweaty brows of men who had long forgotten what it felt like to be clean. In the summer of 1885, the dust was redder than usual, as if the land itself were bleeding. Eliza Hart knew the taste of that dust. It was the grit between her teeth as she hauled buckets of water from the town well, the fine powder that settled on the clean sheets she laid out for travelers at the inn. She moved through the town like a shadow, her head perpetually bowed, her eyes fixed on the splintered boardwalks beneath her feet. At 24, she had learned that to be unseen was to be safe. But safety was a luxury Dusthaven did not offer women who were alone. Inside the inn's common room, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and frying lard. Men, their faces leathered by the sun, watched her as she cleared away wooden plates and mugs. Their gazes were heavy, crawling over her worn calico dress, lingering on the curve of her neck. They did not speak to her directly, not often, but their murmurs followed her, thick and buzzing like flies. She learned to hear without listening, to feel their eyes without looking up. She scrubbed a gravy stain from the rough-hewn table, her knuckles raw, and pretended she was a ghost. Across the dusty expanse of the town square, a man named Ethan Cole was loading supplies into a buckboard hitched to a stoic-looking bay horse. He was a quiet man, his movements economical and sure. At 31, his face was already a map of hard miles and solitary nights, with lines etched around his eyes from squinting into a sun that was both life and death. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth. They remembered him, or the stories about him, from years ago. A gunfight, a sister, a sudden departure. He was a piece of the town's history they preferred to leave buried. Ethan did not waste words. He bought a small keg of nails, 2 sacks of salt, and a roll of heavy canvas from the general store. Paying in coin and leaving without a word of gossip, he moved with a purpose that set him apart from the aimless loitering of other men. As he secured the canvas with a length of rope, his gaze drifted across the square. He saw the inn, and for a moment, he saw the flicker of a woman's dress as she emptied a bucket of dirty water into the street. He saw her pause, her shoulders slumped with a weariness that went deeper than hard work. Then she was gone, back into the shadows of the building. The clanging of the church bell drew all eyes toward the town's center. It was not a call to Sunday worship, but a summons. Mayor Jasper Crow stood on the steps of the small wooden courthouse, a thick Bible in one hand. He was a man whose piety was a weapon, his belly soft but his eyes hard as river stones. His son-in-law, Wade Merrick, stood beside him, handsome and sneering, his hand resting on the polished butt of a holstered pistol. "The soul of Dusthaven is at stake," Mayor Crow declared, his voice booming across the square. "Our reputation as a God-fearing, orderly community is our most valuable asset. It is what separates us from the lawless heathens in the territories. We must guard it. We must purge any element that seeks to tarnish our good name, any stain of immorality that invites wickedness into our homes." A few rows back, Mercy Pike, the pastor's wife, nodded with fervent approval. She nudged the woman next to her, her lips barely moving as she whispered. The whisper spread like a grass fire, a low hiss passing from one bonneted head to another. The name they whispered was Eliza. They spoke of the livery stable, of Wade Merrick's good character, and of a woman's shamelessness. The story had already taken root, its details shifting with each telling, but its conclusion was always the same. Eliza Hart was a disturbance, a problem to be solved. Deputy Tom Avery stood at the edge of the crowd, his hat pulled low. He was a young man, caught between the badge he wore and the truth he was afraid to speak. He had been there, at the livery, that night. He had not seen everything, but he had heard the fear in Eliza's voice, had seen the torn fabric of her sleeve as she fled, and he had seen the smug look on Wade's face afterward. But Wade was the mayor's family, and Tom was just a deputy who wanted to keep his job. So when Eliza later emerged from the inn to fetch water, and her eyes met his for a fleeting second, Tom looked away, a hot shame crawling up his neck. He busied himself checking the cinch on a nearby saddle, his heart thumping a guilty rhythm against his ribs. Eliza felt his avoidance like a slap. She knew. They all knew, or thought they did. She lowered the wooden bucket into the stone well, the rope scraping against her palms. The cool, damp air that rose from the depths was a brief relief from the oppressive heat. As she hauled the heavy bucket up, hand over hand, her sleeve slid down her arm, exposing her wrist. A faint, ugly bruise, the color of a fading plum, marred her skin. A handprint left behind in anger. Across the square, Ethan Cole was about to climb onto his buckboard. A breath of wind, hotter than the last, stirred the red dust. He paused, his sharp eyes catching the movement at the well. He saw the bucket rise, saw the sleeve fall, and saw the dark mark on the woman's wrist. It was a small detail, one that most would miss or ignore, but Ethan had seen a mark like that before, on his own sister. Martha? The sight tightened something in his chest, a cold knot of memory. He did not move, did not speak. He just watched as the woman pulled her sleeve back down, her movements furtive and ashamed, as if hiding a sin rather than an injury. She lifted the heavy bucket, her arms straining. The weight made her stumble, and a little water sloshed over the side, darkening the dust at her feet. She stood there for a long moment, a solitary figure in a town that had already passed its judgment. Ethan finally swung himself up onto the seat of the buckboard. As he gathered the reins, a plain brown handkerchief, worn soft with use, slipped from his coat pocket and fell unnoticed to the ground. It lay there in the dust, just a few feet from the well. He clicked his tongue, and the bay horse started forward, pulling the wagon out of town and toward the low hills that bordered the valley. He did not look back. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in angry shades of orange and purple. The shadows of the buildings stretched long and thin across the square. The whispers that had followed Eliza all day now seemed to cling to the cooling air. She finished her work, her body aching, her mind a storm of fear and injustice. She wanted to run, to simply walk out of Dust Haven and never return, but she had nowhere to go. She had a few coins saved, not nearly enough to buy a ticket on a stagecoach to anywhere meaningful. Here, at least, she had a roof, however precarious, and a wage, however small. As she was lighting the lamps in the common room, the door opened. It was not a traveler or a drunkard. It was Deputy Tom Avery. He stood silhouetted in the doorway, twisting his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. "Eliza Hart," he said, his voice barely a murmur. She froze, her hand hovering over the lamp's wick. She could feel the stares of the few men lingering over their drinks. "The town council requires your presence," he continued, still not looking at her. "Tomorrow, at noon." He did not say why. He did not have to. He held out a folded piece of paper. His hand was trembling slightly. She walked toward him, her legs feeling like lead, and took the summons. The paper was crisp, official. It felt heavy in her hand, like a stone. Tom turned and left without another word, melting back into the twilight. Eliza stood in the doorway, the notice clutched in her hand. The wind picked up, swirling the red dust around her ankles. In the corner of the square, a dark shape stood against the fading light. It was an old post, thick and weathered, its wood splintered and gray. It had been used for tying thieves, for public shaming, long ago. Now it was just a relic. But as she stared at it, a cold dread washed over her. It no longer looked like a forgotten piece of history. It looked like a warning. It looked like the future. The sun at high noon was a merciless hammer. It beat down on the red dust of the square, bleaching the color from the sky and making the air shimmer with heat. The whole of Dusthaven, it seemed, had gathered. They stood in a half circle, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and righteous certainty, a congregation ready for a sermon of shame. Eliza stood before Mayor Crow, Wade Merrick, and two other grim-faced men who made up the town council. The proceedings were a blur of words she could not grasp. Accusations of indecency, of luring a married man, of being a stain upon the community's honor. Wade stood with his arms crossed, a smug, vindictive look on his face. She was given no chance to speak, her attempts to form a denial dying in her throat as the mayor's voice drowned her out. The verdict had been decided long before the bell ever rang. For the preservation of decency and as a warning to all who might stray from the path of righteousness, Mayor Crow intoned, his voice swelling with false piety. This council sentences Eliza Hart to 3 hours of public penance. Let this community see the face of sin and turn away from it. He gestured to the old post in the corner of the square. A collective murmur went through the crowd, a sound of grim satisfaction. Eliza's blood ran cold. She looked for a single sympathetic face, a flicker of doubt, but found none. She saw only the hard, unforgiving eyes of people convinced of their own virtue. "Deputy," the mayor commanded. Tom Avery shuffled forward, his face pale beneath his tan. He would not meet her eyes. He took her arm, his touch surprisingly gentle, but his grip was firm. He led her toward the post, the crowd parting to let them pass. Whispers followed them, sharp and cruel as burrs. He should have run her out of town. "Look at her, not even crying, shameless." Mercy Pike stood near the front, her hands clasped as if in prayer. "The Lord's work is sometimes hard," she said to the woman beside her, loud enough for Eliza to hear. When they reached the post, Tom fumbled with a length of coarse rope. "I am sorry," he mumbled, his voice so low she barely heard it. He wrapped the rope around her wrists, binding them to the splintered wood. The rope was rough, and it bit into the tender skin of her bruised wrist, sending a sharp pain up her arm. He finished the knot and stepped back quickly, retreating into the anonymity of the crowd as if he had touched something hot. And then it began. At first, it was just the sun, a relentless weight on her head and shoulders. Then came the words, a barrage of insults that struck harder than stones. The first missile was a rotten tomato, thrown by a boy no older than 10. It splattered against her shoulder, the sour juice and seeds running down her dress. The crowd laughed. That broke the dam. Soon, a rain of refuse fell upon her, a withered turnip, a handful of moldy beans, the core of an apple. Each impact was a fresh wave of humiliation. She closed her eyes, trying to retreat into some corner of her mind where they could not reach her, but there was no escape. The stench of spoiled food, the heat, the biting ropes, the cruel laughter, it was all there. Time ceased to have meaning. She felt her strength draining away, leaving her body a hollow shell of pain and shame. Her head drooped, her hair falling across her face in sweat-soaked strands. Her throat was a desert, raw and dry. A single, desperate thought pushed through the fog of her misery. She wanted it to end. She would do anything for it to end. She pulled weakly against the ropes. A futile gesture, a sob, dry and ragged, tore from her chest. She lifted her head, her vision swimming. She could barely make out the faces in the crowd, twisted into masks of contempt. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking, a sound lost in the noise. She tried again, forcing the words from her raw throat, a plea directed at no one and everyone. "Please, let me go." The words were a thread of sound, but they carried the weight of her entire being. They were the last piece of her will, offered up to a merciless sky. A stillness began at the edge of the crowd. A man on a bay horse had appeared, as if from the shimmering heat itself. He sat tall in the saddle, taking in the scene with an unreadable expression. It was Ethan Cole. The crowd's jeers faltered, replaced by uneasy murmurs. He dismounted, his movements unhurried, and looped the reins over a hitching post. He started walking toward the center of the square. The crowd, which had felt like an impenetrable wall, seemed to melt away before him. People stepped aside, their bravados shrinking under his steady, silent gaze. There was a coiled stillness about him, a promise of violence held in perfect check that they all remembered. He walked through the path they made for him, his boots leaving quiet prints in the dusty ground littered with garbage. He did not look at the crowd. His eyes were fixed on Eliza. He stopped in front of her. He saw the filth on her dress, the raw chafe of the ropes on her wrists, the utter despair in her eyes. He stood there for a long moment, and in the profound silence that had fallen, Eliza could hear the buzzing of a fly. Then Ethan turned his head and looked at Mayor Crow. "Let her go," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a blade. Mayor Crow puffed out his chest, his authority challenged. "This is the council's judgment. Cole, this woman has brought shame upon us. This is town business." "This is not justice," Ethan said, his voice flat and cold. "This is a spectacle for bored hypocrites. Cut her down." Wade Merrick stepped forward, his hand dropping to his pistol. "You have no say here, drifter. Ride on before you find yourself in trouble." Ethan ignored him. He turned back to the mayor. "I will not ask again." "You will obey the law of this town," Crow thundered, his face turning a blotchy red, "or you will face the consequences." Ethan looked from the mayor's furious face to the ropes binding Eliza. He seemed to come to a decision. Without another word, he reached to his belt and drew a long bladed knife. The sunlight caught the steel, sending a flash across the stunned faces of the crowd. Before anyone could react, he stepped forward, raised the knife, and with one clean, powerful slice, severed the ropes. Eliza's arms fell limp, and her legs, no longer held up by the tension of the ropes, gave way. She would have crumpled to the ground, but Ethan was there. He caught her, his arms sliding around her back, supporting her weight. She sagged against him, the scent of leather, dust, and clean sweat filling her senses, a stark contrast to the rotten smell of her humiliation. He held her for a moment, letting her find her footing. He paid no mind to the gasps from the crowd or the enraged sputtering of the mayor. He looked down at Eliza, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. His voice was low, for her alone, but in the dead quiet of the square, the words carried, "If they punish you for being alone, come with me," he said, his gaze steady and direct. "Stay at the ranch until you want to leave." He paused, and his next words were even softer, a question that hung in the oppressive air like a prayer. "If one day you want to be my wife, the choice is yours." She stared at him, unable to comprehend the words. Wife choice. These were concepts from another world. She could only see the unexpected kindness in his eyes, an anchor in the swirling chaos of her world. All she could manage was a slight, trembling nod. It was enough. A wave of whispers broke the silence of the crowd. They remembered the stories. Ethan Cole, the gunfighter who had faced down 2 men in this very square. The man who had left town after his sister, Martha, had been shunned by the church and had died alone. He was a man who lived by his own law, and he had just declared war on theirs. Ethan straightened up, keeping a supportive arm around Eliza. He shot a final, hard look at Crow and Wade, a look that was a clear and unequivocal promise. Then he led Eliza toward his horse. The crowd parted for them again, a sea of bewildered and fearful faces. He lifted her easily onto the saddle, her worn dress stained and torn, then swung up behind her. He took the reins in one hand, his other arm securely around her waist, holding her steady. Without a backward glance, he urged the horse into a slow walk. They rode straight through the center of the square, past the courthouse, past the church, past the wide-eyed stares of the people of Dusthaven. They left behind the filth, the shame, and the silent, sputtering rage of the mayor, and headed for the open country, where the only judgment came from the vast, empty sky. The ride was long and silent. Eliza felt every jolt of the horse's gait, every shift of Ethan's body behind her. She kept herself rigid, a pillar of shame, her mind a blank slate of shock. The sun beat down, but she felt a chill deep in her bones. The world beyond Dusthaven was a blur of parched earth and hardy scrub brush. She did not know how much time had passed when the horse slowed, its hooves moving from the hard-packed trail to softer ground. She looked up. They had arrived at a small homestead tucked into a shallow valley, sheltered by a stand of tall, whispering pines. A low house, built of sturdy, weathered logs, sat beside a small but well-kept stable. A large wooden barrel stood near the porch to catch rainwater, and a thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a lonely signal in the vast wilderness. It was a place of profound solitude, a world away from the suffocating closeness of the town. Ethan swung down from the horse in one fluid motion and then turned to her. He did not speak, just held up his hands to help her down. For a moment, she flinched. The memory of other hands, rough and unwanted, still fresh, but his gaze was steady, patient. She allowed him to lift her down, her feet finding the ground with a soft thud. Her legs were weak, trembling from the ordeal and the long ride. He led the horse to the stable, and she stood alone in the yard, a small, lost figure in the immense landscape. The wind sighed through the pines, a sound so clean and lonely it made her throat ache. This was his home, a place of quiet and order, a place he had brought her, a woman publicly branded as a sinner. She did not understand. When he returned, he did not approach her directly, but went to the porch of the small house. He pushed the door open and went inside, leaving it ajar for her. It was not a command, but an invitation. She hesitated, her feet feeling rooted to the dusty earth. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to run to. Taking a shaky breath, she walked up the 2 wooden steps and crossed the threshold. The inside was simple, clean, and masculine. A single room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. In a corner was a narrow bed, its blanket pulled taut. Everything had its place. There were no frills, no clutter, only the bare essentials of a solitary life. Ethan was at the fireplace, stoking the embers. He did not look at her as he spoke. "There is a room through there," he said, nodding toward a closed door. "It is small, but it is clean." He moved to a cast-iron stove and picked up a heavy kettle. "I will fetch fresh water. There is a basin in the room." He went back outside. Eliza stood frozen, her arms wrapped around herself. A room, a door she could close. She walked toward it and pushed it open. It was, as he said, very small, containing only a narrow cot with a neatly folded blanket at its foot, a small washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher, and a single, high window. It was a cell, almost, but the thought of the closed door was a comfort beyond measure. Ethan returned with a bucket of water, the sound of it sloshing the only noise. He poured some into the pitcher on the stand, then set the bucket by the door. "There is cornbread on the table," he said, his back still to her, "and a change of clothes on the cot, an old shirt of mine. It will be large, but it is clean." Then he was gone, back into the main room, closing her door gently behind him. She was alone. The silence was absolute. She listened for any sound, any sign of what he might do, but heard only the quiet crackle of the fire and the distant sigh of the wind. She touched the old cotton shirt he had left. It was worn soft from countless washings. A wave of exhaustion so profound it was like a physical blow washed over her. and she sank onto the edge of the cot. The trembling started in her hands and spread through her entire body. The tears she had refused to shed in the square now came, hot and silent, tracking clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She cried for her lost dignity, for her loneliness, for the terrifying, inexplicable kindness of this strange man. That night, as a cold that was unique to the high desert settled over the land, she huddled under the wool blanket, wearing his shirt. It smelled of wood smoke and the faint, clean scent of the outdoors. It swallowed her whole, the sleeves hanging far past her hands, but it felt like a suit of armor. Outside her window, the stars were scattered across the black sky like a spill of salt, thick and brilliant and impossibly far away. She thought she heard him moving around the main room, a floorboard creaking, the scrape of a chair. Later, she heard him step outside onto the porch. She imagined him out there, a solitary guardian under the vast, cold sky, and a sliver of peace settled in her heart. For the first time in a very long time, she felt the possibility of safety. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee. The light coming through her small window was pale and gray. For a long moment, she lay still, the events of the previous day rushing back, a sickening tide. But the shame was mixed with something else now, a fragile curiosity. She rose, washed her face in the cool water, and braided her hair. The face that looked back at her from the small, cracked mirror on the wall was pale and haunted, but it was her own. She put on her filthy, stained dress, but before she left the room, she folded the blanket he had provided and placed it carefully at the foot of the cot. It was a small gesture, a silent acknowledgement. When she stepped into the main room, he was sitting at the table, a tin cup of coffee in his hands. He had already eaten. A plate with a piece of cornbread and a strip of dried meat sat at the other end of the table. For her, he did not speak, just nodded toward the plate. She sat down, her movements stiff, and ate in silence. The food was plain, but it tasted like a feast. He finished his coffee and stood up. He pulled on a heavy leather coat that looked as weathered and sturdy as he was. "I have chores," he said. "The house is yours. Do as you please. Rest." He left. She watched him from the window as he crossed the yard to the stable. He moved with an easy, powerful grace, a man perfectly at home in his world. She stayed inside for hours, too wary to venture out. She felt the weight of the shame he had rescued her from, a guilt that had been so thoroughly drilled into her that she almost believed it herself. She was a fallen woman, a disgrace. What was she doing in this good, quiet man's home? The conflict churned inside her, the ingrained feeling of her own sinfulness warring with a desperate, burgeoning hope. Finally, the need for order, for usefulness, became too strong to ignore. She took their plates to a basin of water and washed them. She scrubbed them clean, her hands finding comfort in the simple, repetitive task. Outside the front door, a small collection of clay pots held struggling herbs. She recognized mint and thyme. They were drooping, thirsty. She found the water bucket, carried it outside, and carefully watered each plant, her fingers gently clearing away the dust from their leaves. The simple act of nurturing something, of bringing a small bit of life back from the brink, settled her trembling spirit. She saw him later, near the side of the porch, hammering. A loose step had been bothering him. He worked with methodical precision, driving each new nail deep into the wood with clean, efficient blows. Each strike of the hammer seemed to fix something in place, to make the world a little more solid, a little more secure. He was a man who repaired what was broken. That evening, as they sat in the growing dark, the only light coming from the flickering fire, he spoke of his sister. He did not look at her, but stared into the flames, his voice low and rough with memory. "I had a sister," he said. "Her name was Martha. She was young, full of life." He paused, and the silence stretched, filled with the ghosts of what he was not saying. She fell in love with a man who was promised to another. They met in secret. When it came out, the town, the church, they turned on her. They called her the same names they called you. He picked up a small piece of wood and began to whittle at it with his knife. The shavings falling into the hearth. I was young, angry. I challenged the man. There was a fight. When the dust settled, I had to leave town for a while. I left her here to face them alone. He stopped whittling, his hands still. When I came back, it was too late. The shame had done its work. She took ill in the winter, and no one would help. They said it was God's punishment. She died alone. He did not need to say more. Eliza understood everything. She understood the cold fury in his eyes in the square. The reason he had acted when no one else would. He was not saving her out of pity. He was saving her for Martha. He was righting an old, terrible wrong, the only way he knew how. A few days passed in this quiet rhythm. He worked his land. She tended to the small house. They spoke little, but a language of shared tasks and mutual respect began to form between them. He would leave a bucket of fresh milk on the porch. She would leave a plate of warm food on the table. One afternoon, he led a gentle mare from the stable, its saddle old but well cared for. "You should know how to ride," he said, "not as a command, but as a statement of fact. A woman alone needs to be able to move." She agreed. She let him show her how to mount, how to hold the reins. His hands were calloused and strong as he guided hers, his touch impersonal and instructive. She was clumsy at first, but the mare was patient, and Ethan's quiet instructions were clear. She learned. The feeling of being on the horse, of being in control of her own movement, was a revelation. It was a taste of freedom. That evening, she found him on the porch. "I should not be a burden to you any longer," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was the hardest thing she had ever had to say. He looked at her, his face shadowed in the twilight. "Is that what you want?" She looked out at the valley, at the vast, peaceful emptiness of it all. "I do not know what I want," she confessed. "I only know I cannot stay here forever." "Stay a few more days. Then," he said, "until you are stronger, until you decide." She nodded, a wave of relief so strong it made her weak. A few more days. The next morning, when she went out to the stable to practice with the mare, she saw something new. Tied to the worn leather of the saddle horn, fluttering slightly in the breeze, was a plain brown handkerchief. It was clean and neatly folded. It was not a gift. It was a symbol, a quiet, unassuming promise, a sign that he had made his choice, and now he was simply waiting, patiently, for her to make hers. The quiet days at the homestead began to knit themselves into a life. Eliza found a rhythm that was entirely new to her, a pattern woven from simple, meaningful tasks. She learned the difference between the scent of pine and the scent of juniper on the wind. She discovered that Ethan kept a small herd of goats, and she found a quiet satisfaction in herding them to their pen in the evenings. One afternoon, a nanny goat went into a difficult labor. Ethan was mending a fence on the far side of his property. Panic seized Eliza for a moment, but then she remembered the calm, steady way he did everything. She took a deep breath, spoke to the distressed animal in a low, soothing voice, and gently helped bring 2 tiny, bleeding kids into the world. When Ethan returned, he found her sitting in the hay, exhausted but with a look of quiet pride, the new mother licking her clean offspring. He said nothing, but he left an extra portion of stew for her on the table that night. She started tending to his small garden of herbs with a fierce devotion, her fingers learning the feel of their leaves. She arranged the dried bundles in the rafters, and the small cabin began to smell of thyme and sage, a clean, earthy scent that pushed back against the ever-present dust. One morning, as she was practicing with the gentle mare in the corral, the horse sneezed, a great, gusty explosion that sent a shower of dust and spittle all over the front of her borrowed shirt. The surprise of it, the sheer absurdity, broke through the wall of sorrow she had built around her heart. A sound bubbled up from her chest, unfamiliar and strange. It was a laugh, a real, unburdened laugh. It felt rusty, like a pump that had not been used in years. But it was there. She laughed until tears streamed down her face, and the mayor just looked at her with wide, placid eyes, as if wondering what all the fuss was about. But while a fragile peace was taking root in the small valley, the seeds of hatred were being carefully cultivated in Dust Haven. Ethan's act of defiance had not been forgotten. It had festered. Mayor Crow saw it not as an act of mercy, but as a direct challenge to his iron-fisted rule. He could not allow it to stand. "He harbors the woman in his home," Crow declared to a gathering of the town's most influential men, his voice dripping with sanctimony. "He lives with her, unmarried, in open defiance of God and the laws of this community. This is not just about her sin anymore. It is about his rebellion. It is a cancer that must be cut out before it infects us all." Wade Merrick, his bruised ego still smarting, fanned the flames. "Cole thinks he is above us all. He always has. It is time we showed him that his land, his home, everything he has, exists only by the grace of this town's good order." The whispers that Mercy Pike had so skillfully planted now bloomed into a chorus of moral outrage. The story of Eliza the seductress became intertwined with the tale of Ethan the lawless gunfighter. They were two sides of the same corrupt coin, a threat to every decent, God-fearing family in Dust Haven. Mayor Crow, sensing the town was behind him, filed a formal complaint with the territorial magistrate, a man he knew to be a close associate. The charge was harboring a person of ill repute and engaging in a manner of living that threatens public decency. The proposed penalty was severe unless Eliza Hart signed a full confession of her sins, admitting her guilt and accepting the town's original judgment. Ethan Cole's land claim would be declared forfeit. Late one night, long after the saloon had closed and the town was shrouded in darkness, a lone figure slipped through the shadows. Deputy Tom Avery, his conscience a relentless tormentor, found himself standing before the livery stable. He had avoided this place, avoided the memory of what he had failed to do, but he could not rest. He lit a small lantern, keeping the light low, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the familiar smell of hay and horsehide. He went to the stall where he had seen Wade trap Eliza. He ran his hands over the rough wooden planks, his heart pounding. Then his lantern light caught something small and white, snagged on a splintered rail. It was a tiny scrap of lace, torn from the cuff of a woman's dress. He recognized it as the same cheap lace that trimmed the sleeves of Eliza's worn calico. He carefully worked it free and tucked it into his pocket. Emboldened, he searched the dusty floor. In the corner, half buried in the straw, his fingers brushed against something hard and round. He pulled it out. It was a brass button, ornate and distinctive. He had seen buttons just like it on the vest Wade Merrick wore almost every day. He closed his fist around the two small pieces of evidence. They felt heavy in his hand, a terrible and dangerous weight. A few days later, a small procession made its way up the trail to Ethan's homestead. It was a delegation of women, led by Mercy Pike. They carried no rotten vegetables, only Bibles. They stopped just outside his property line, a silent, black-clad army of judgment. Ethan saw them from the stable. He walked out to meet them, his face a calm, unreadable mask. Eliza watched from the window of the house, her blood turning to ice. "We have come to pray for the soul of this fallen woman," Mercy Pike announced, her voice ringing with self-righteousness. "And for you, Mr. Cole, that you might see the error of your ways and cast this sinner out from your home." Ethan stopped a few feet from them, his hands at his sides. "You can pray where you stand," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But you will not set foot on my land." "This is God's land," one of the women declared. "This is the plot I filed a claim on and work every day," Ethan replied, his voice still level. "And I am telling you to stay off it. Your prayers are not welcome here." He held their gazes, one by one. There was no anger in his eyes, only an unyielding resolve that was more intimidating than any threat. The women shuffled their feet, their pious certainty wavering in the face of his calm defiance. After a long, Tense silence. Mercy Pike gave a curt nod, and they turned and marched back the way they came. That night, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The wind began to pick up, not the gentle sigh of the pines, but a low, angry moan that grew into a howl. A dust storm, fierce and sudden, swept down from the mountains. It blotted out the sun, plunging the world into a choking, reddish gloom. Dust seeped through every crack in the small cabin, coating everything in a fine, gritty film. Ethan and Eliza worked together, stuffing rags into the gaps around the door and the window frames. The wind shrieked, and the house seemed to tremble under its assault. Suddenly, a new sound joined the storm's chorus, a steady drip, drip, drip. A leak had sprung in the roof, directly over Eliza's small room. Water, stained brown with dust, began to pool on the floor. Ethan grabbed a bucket while Eliza lit another lantern. He climbed onto a chair, trying to find the source. "It is a loose shingle," he said, his voice raised over the roar of the wind. "I cannot fix it until this storm passes." He climbed down, his shirt damp. He looked at Eliza, standing in the flickering lantern light, her shoulders hunched against the invading cold. He went to a peg on the wall and took down his heavy leather coat. He held it out to her. "Here," he said. "You will be cold." She hesitated, then reached for it. As she took the coat, her fingers brushed against his. His hand was warm and rough with calluses. The brief touch sent a jolt through her, a current of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She pulled the coat on. It was huge on her, heavy and comforting, smelling of him, of leather and wood smoke. They sat by the fire, the only island of warmth and light in the howling darkness. The storm outside was a living thing, a monster trying to tear their small sanctuary apart. They did not speak for a long time. Just listened to the wind. "Are you afraid?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked into the flames, his profile etched by the light. "I am afraid of failing," he said, his voice low and honest, "of not being there when I am needed most. I failed my sister. I will not fail again." "I am afraid of them," she confessed, her own voice trembling slightly. "I am afraid they will never let me go, that no matter where I am, I will always be the woman they tied to that post." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and steady. "They do not define you, Eliza. What they did defines them." They sat in the shared quiet, two lonely souls finding solace in a shared confession of fear. The storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, something had shifted. A bond had been forged in the heart of the tempest, stronger than wood and stone. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving behind a world scoured clean and a sky of brilliant, aching blue. The calm felt strange, unnatural. Later that day, as Eliza was feeding the chickens, she saw a rider approaching. It was Deputy Tom Avery. He looked tired and grim. He avoided her eyes as he dismounted, just as he had done in the town square. He walked up to Ethan, who had come out onto the porch. The deputy held out a folded piece of paper, the official seal of the territory visible on its surface. "This is for Eliza Hart," he said, his voice flat. He thrust it toward Ethan. Ethan did not take it. He just looked at the deputy. "Give it to her." Tom Avery turned to Eliza, his face a mask of misery. She walked toward him, her heart a cold stone in her chest, and took the summons. She did not need to read it to know what it was. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. The legal words were stark and brutal. The complaint, the threat to Ethan's land, and the condition for his salvation, her public confession. She looked up from the paper, at this small homestead that had become the only safe harbor she had ever known. She looked at Ethan, at his strong, quiet face, the man who had asked for nothing and offered her everything. They wanted to take it all away from him, and they had given her the power to stop them. All she had to do was destroy herself. Eliza held the paper in her hand. the crisp edges a stark contrast to the trembling of her fingers. The words were a brand, a legal instrument designed to sear a lie into her soul. "Confess," it said, "and the man who saved you can keep his home. Renounce your own truth, accept their filthy narrative, and he will be safe." She looked at Ethan, who stood on the porch watching her, his face carved from shadow and patience. He had not asked to see the document. He did not need to. He knew the ways of men like Jasper Crow. "They cannot take this land," he said, his voice a low rumble. "My claim is legal. It will hold up." "It says they will challenge it," she replied, her own voice thin. "It says they will bring in a magistrate from Santa Fe. They will bury you in court fees and lies. You will lose everything. It is just land. Eliza." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Just land. To a man like him, who had nothing else, it was everything. It was his past and his future, his sanctuary, his penance. He was offering it up for her, a woman he barely knew, a woman who had brought nothing but trouble to his door. The weight of that sacrifice was too much to bear. It would be so easy to sign the paper, to write her name, to accept the role of the sinner, and to disappear, leaving him in peace with his property intact. It was what she had been taught to do her entire life, to bend, to acquiesce, to make herself smaller for the comfort of others. But something had changed in her. The quiet days in this valley, the feel of a horse moving under her own command, the simple act of birthing a new life into the world, it had all conspired to rebuild something in her that she thought was long dead. Her spine. She looked from Ethan's steady face to the distant, hazy shape of Dust Haven. She thought of the faces in the crowd, hungry for her humiliation. She thought of the rotten fruit striking her skin, of the rough ropes, of the mayor's booming, self-righteous voice. A cold, clean anger rose in her, an emotion so pure it burned away the last vestiges of her fear. She walked to the porch and stood before Ethan. She held out the paper, not for him to take, but for him to see her resolve. "I will not sign it," she said, her voice clear and strong. She looked him directly in the eye, and for the first time she did not feel like a rescued stray. She felt like his equal. She took a deep breath, and the words came, not just for him, but for herself. A declaration of survival aimed at the ghosts of the town. "I have survived your fear. I will not be consumed by it." A slow smile touched the corners of Ethan's mouth, a rare and beautiful thing. He nodded, a single, sharp gesture of profound respect. "I know," was all he said, as if the sky itself had been waiting for her decision. A dramatic shift began. The brilliant blue overhead deepened to a bruised purple at the horizon. The air, which had been dry and still, grew heavy and thick with an unnatural humidity. A low rumble, too deep to be thunder, echoed from the distant mountains. The few clouds that had been drifting lazily began to swell and darken, their bellies turning a menacing shade of gray. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of ozone and wet earth, a scent so foreign in this parched land that it was both a promise and a threat. The first drops of rain were fat and slow. Striking the dusty ground with a hiss, they left dark circles in the red dirt, like coins. Then more came, and more, until the slow, sparse drops became a steady drumming on the roof of the cabin. It was a sound of life, a blessing in this land of perpetual drought. But the drumming grew louder, turning into a roar. The sky opened, and a deluge unlike anything the valley had seen in years hammered the baked, unyielding earth. The ground could not absorb such a fury. The water, instead of sinking in, began to run, forming rivulets that quickly merged into streams, then torrents. The dry arroyo that snaked through the valley, a dusty scar for most of the year, began to fill. A low roar grew in the distance, the sound of a great beast awakening. "The stable!" Ethan yelled over the din. "Already running. Eliza was right behind him." A wall of brown, Churning water, thick with mud and debris, was surging down the arroyo. It was a flash flood, a sudden, violent release of the storm's power. It slammed into the small stable with the force of a battering ram. Timbers groaned and splintered. The horses inside screamed, a sound of pure terror. The floodwater, diverted by the stable, began to spread across the valley floor. A muddy, fast-moving lake. It swirled around the corral, tore at the fence posts Ethan had just mended, and began to climb the slight slope toward the house. Ethan fought his way through the thigh-deep water to the stable door, which was jammed shut by the pressure. "The horses!" Eliza cried, her voice thin against the roar. Together, they put their shoulders to the door and shoved. It gave with a sickening crack, and they stumbled inside. The water was already knee-deep, and the horses were frantic, their eyes white with fear, rearing and kicking in their stalls. Working as a team, their movements efficient and desperate, they began to unlatch the stalls. Ethan took the lead rope of the first panicked horse, speaking to it in a low, calming voice, while Eliza fought to open the next gate, one by one. They led the terrified animals out of the collapsing stable and toward the higher ground near the pine trees. It was as she was leading the last horse, the gentle mare, to safety that she saw it, a small figure, caught in the main current of the flood, being swept down the valley. The figure was clinging desperately to a broken fence post. It was a girl. It was Rosie Quinn, the young serving girl from the inn. "Ethan!" she screamed, pointing. Rosie had lost her grip on the post and was being tumbled in the muddy water. Her head went under, then reappeared, her mouth open in a silent cry. Without a second thought, Eliza thrust the mare's reins into Ethan's hand. She grabbed a long coil of rope from a hook on the stable wall, looped one end around a sturdy pine tree, and tied the other around her own waist. She did not wait for Ethan's approval or his protest. She plunged into the flood. The water was a brutal, physical force. It was colder than she could have imagined, and it pulled at her, trying to drag her downstream. It was full of unseen dangers, rocks and branches that scraped and bruised her legs. But she kept her eyes fixed on Rosie, who was now snagged on the branches of a submerged bush not 20 yards away. "Rosie, hold on!" Eliza yelled, her voice raw. She fought her way through the current, the rope playing out behind her, her only anchor to the world. She reached the bush, her lungs burning, and grabbed a fistful of Rosie's soaking dress. The girl was limp, her eyes wide with terror, too frightened to even cry. Eliza pulled her close, trying to shield her from the debris-filled water. From the bank, a man watched, frozen. Deputy Tom Avery, soaked to the bone, had followed them from town, tasked by the mayor to ensure the summons was obeyed. He had seen Eliza's defiance, and then he had seen the storm break. He had been about to turn back when the flood hit. Now, he stood on the edge of the chaos, a helpless witness. He saw the woman the town called a sinner, the woman he had helped condemn, risking her own life to save a child. The image burned itself into his mind, incinerating the last of his cowardly excuses. Eliza, her strength failing, began to pull herself and Rosie back toward the tree, hand over hand on the rope. It was a desperate, slow-motion battle against the relentless current. Back in Dust Haven, the storm was also wreaking havoc. The main street was a river of mud. The force of the water flowing through the town square lapped at the base of the old shaming post. The ground around it, already softened by the rain, began to give way. The post, which had stood as a symbol of the town's rigid justice for decades, leaned precariously. Its foundation loosened, its authority compromised. As darkness fell, the rain finally subsided, leaving behind a world of devastation and an eerie quiet. At the homestead, Rosie was safe, wrapped in every blanket they owned, asleep from exhaustion by the fire. The stable was a wreck, half of its walls torn away. The lower pasture was a sea of mud. Eliza and Ethan stood on the porch, looking out at the wreckage. They were soaked, bruised, and utterly exhausted, but they were alive. They had saved the horses, and they had saved a child. In the midst of the destruction, something new and strong had been forged between them. But the night was not over. As they stood there, a new light began to grow on the horizon, a flickering, unnatural orange that was not the moon. It grew brighter, painting the undersides of the clouds in a hellish glow. Eliza felt a new dread, colder than the floodwater. "What is that?" Ethan's face was grim, his eyes hard as flint as he stared at the light. He did not need to guess. The light was coming from the direction of his upper field, where his hay barn stood, full of the winter feed for his animals. "Crow," he said, the name a curse. The chaos of the flood had been an opportunity, an act of God to cover up an act of man. The water had tried to destroy them and failed. So now, the mayor was sending fire. The orange glow pulsed against the black sky, a beacon of pure malice, and the battle for their survival entered a new, more terrible stage. The orange glow of the fire ate a hole in the night sky. By the time Ethan and Eliza reached the hay barn, it was a roaring inferno, a cathedral of flame consuming months of hard work. There was nothing to be done but watch it burn, the heat a physical blow against their faces. They stood in silence as the structure groaned and collapsed in on itself, sending a fountain of sparks up to meet the stars. The fire was not a random act of nature like the flood. It was a message, written in ash and smoke. It said, "We can touch you. We can destroy you." As dawn broke, casting a sickly gray light over the smoldering ruins and the flood-ravaged valley, something in Ethan Cole settled into a hard, cold resolve. The time for quiet endurance was over. He had tried to live apart from Dust Haven, to build a life on its periphery, but the town's poison had seeped out and followed them. Now, he would carry the fight back to its source. He found Eliza on the porch, staring at the rising sun. Rosie was still asleep inside. "Safe. Get your things," he said. His voice flat. "We are going back." She looked at him, her eyes wide. "Back to what?" "To the truth," he said. "They want a public spectacle. We will give them one." As they rode toward town, they saw another rider approaching. It was Deputy Tom Avery. He looked as if he had not slept, his face drawn and pale. He reined in his horse, blocking their path. For a moment, Ethan's hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip. "I am not here to stop you," the deputy said quickly, raising a hand. His voice was shaky, but his eyes were filled with a new, unfamiliar determination. He looked past Ethan to Eliza. "What you did yesterday, for Rosie, I saw it." He took a deep breath. A man stepping off a cliff. "I cannot let this go on." He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out 2 small items and held them in his palm, a scrap of white lace and a single brass button. "I found these in the livery stable," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Where it happened." He looked directly at Ethan. "And Rosie Quinn. She saw it all. She told me this morning. She saw Wade Merrick drag Eliza into the stall." The 3 of them sat on their horses in the middle of the trail, the smoking ruin of the barn behind them, the corrupt town ahead. The air was still and heavy. A silent pact was made. Ethan gave a curt nod. "Ride with us, deputy?" The town square was already crowded. Mayor Crow, standing on the courthouse steps, had intended to hold a hearing to formalize the confiscation of Ethan's land. He had expected a broken man, a defeated woman. He did not expect to see Ethan Cole riding into the center of the square, Eliza Hart at his side, sitting tall and straight in her saddle, with the town's own deputy flanking them. The wind was picking up again, whipping dust into the air and rattling the loose board on the general store's sign. It was a nervous, agitated wind, mirroring the mood of the crowd. Their murmurs rippled through the square as Ethan and Eliza dismounted. Crow's face hardened, his eyes narrowing to angry slits. "This is an official proceeding," he boomed, trying to seize control. We are here to pass judgment on the illegal and immoral conduct of... We are here to hear the truth, Ethan cut in, his voice carrying over the mayor's. He did not shout. He did not have to. Every eye was on him. He walked to the bottom of the steps, forcing Crow to look down at him. You have made public accusations. Now you will listen to a public answer. Wade Merrick pushed his way to his father-in-law's side, his hand resting on his pistol. You have no right to disrupt. Let him speak, a voice called from the crowd. It was one of the ranchers, a man who had long distrusted Crow's ambition. Another voice agreed. A seed of doubt had been planted. Before the mayor could protest further, Tom Avery stepped forward, holding a small notebook. As a sworn officer of the law in this territory, he began, his voice shaking but clear. I have conducted an investigation into the original complaint against Eliza Hart. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Crow's face turned purple with rage. Deputy, you will stand down. This is insubordination. Tom ignored him, his eyes fixed on the faces in the crowd. On the night in question, I was present at the livery. I heard Miss Hart tell Wade Merrick to leave her alone. I saw her run from the stable in distress. He held up the scrap of lace. This was torn from her dress and left on a splintered board inside. He then held up the button, and this was found in the straw on the floor. A button matching the vest Mr. Merrick wears every day. He looked at Wade, who had gone pale. And there is another witness. Tom turned and nodded toward Eliza, who went to her horse and helped a small, trembling figure down. It was Rosie Quinn. Rosie stood before the crowd, clutching Eliza's hand, her small body shaking. She looked at the faces staring at her, and her courage almost failed. Then she looked at Eliza, and she saw the woman who had plunged into a raging flood to save her. She took a deep breath. I was in the hayloft, Rosie whispered, her voice barely audible. I saw it. Mr. Merrick. He would not let her pass. He grabbed her. She told him no. He pulled her into the dark. I heard her cry out, and then she ran. The crowd was utterly still. The only sound the whistling of the wind, the story they had so eagerly consumed, the one that confirmed all their prejudices, was crumbling before their eyes. Then Eliza stepped forward. She was not the same woman who had been tied to the post in this square. Her gaze was level, her voice calm and devoid of melodrama. She did not plead or accuse. She simply told her story. She spoke of Wade's advances at the inn, of his threats, of the moment in the livery when he had cornered her. She spoke without embellishment, her words plain and heavy as stones. He told me no one would believe me, she finished, her eyes finding Wade in the crowd. He said this town would always believe a man like him over a woman like me. He was almost right. Wade Merrick, his face a mask of fury and humiliation, saw his world collapsing. The whispers of the crowd had turned against him. He saw the doubt in their eyes, the dawning contempt. His hand, which had been hovering over his gun, now closed around the handle. He was trapped. With a snarl of pure desperation, he drew the pistol, the click of the hammer cocking unnaturally loud in the silence. She is a liar, he spat, waving the gun wildly. They are all liars. The crowd gasped and shrank back. But before Wade could aim, before he could make his final, fatal mistake, there was a deafening crack. It was not Wade's gun. Ethan stood 20 feet away, his own pistol drawn, a thin curl of smoke rising from the barrel. High on the courthouse wall, a piece of wood splintered from the painted sign, a new hole beside the faded letters. In the split second of shock that followed, Ethan moved. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He struck Wade's wrist with the side of his hand, a sharp, precise blow that sent the pistol clattering to the dusty ground. Ethan kicked it away, then seized Wade by the front of his shirt, holding him fast. He had ended the threat without spilling a drop of blood. The confrontation was over in an instant, but its impact hung in the air. The crowd stared, not just at the disarmed and defeated Wade, but at Ethan. This was the gunfighter they had feared, but he had used his deadly skill not to kill, but to preserve the peace, to allow the truth to be heard. It was in that moment of quiet awe that the final piece of the town's old order broke. Mercy Pike, who had been standing near the front, her face a storm of conflicting emotions, stepped forward. She looked at Mayor Crow, at his sputtering rage, and then at Eliza. Standing tall and unbroken, the pastor's wife, the guardian of the town's morality, turned to face her friends and neighbors. "We were wrong," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. She looked at Eliza. "The Lord does not ask us to break the weak to prove our own strength. He asks us to mend what is broken." She turned back to the crowd, her gaze sweeping over them. "We have been listening to the voice of pride, not the voice of God." Her words were a balm on the town's raw conscience. The hard-set faces in the crowd softened. The anger and suspicion began to drain away, replaced by a collective, unspoken shame. Tom Avery stepped forward and picked up Wade's pistol. He took Wade from Ethan's grasp. "Wade Merrick," he said, his voice now firm and official. "You are under arrest." As the deputy led the sputtering, defeated man away, Mayor Crow stood alone on the steps, his power gone. His authority evaporated into the dusty air. The crowd was no longer his to command. They were looking at Eliza Hart. And Eliza stood in the center of the square, in the very place where she had been bound and shamed. The wind blew a strand of hair across her face, but she did not brush it away. She did not need to hide. She had faced down the town's judgment and won, not with weapons or with power, but with the simple, unyielding weight of the truth. She was no longer bent. She was standing straight. The walk back to the homestead was a journey through a world transformed. The raw, violent energy of the morning had dissipated, leaving behind a profound and heavy silence. The people of Dust Haven, their faces a mixture of shame and bewilderment, had melted back into their homes, leaving the square empty save for the debris of their abandoned judgment. The wind had died down, and the air was clean, washed by the storm. Eliza rode beside Ethan, the silence between them no longer a space of caution, but one of shared understanding. They had faced the town together and had not broken. The land they rode through was scarred by the flood, the familiar landscape altered, but it felt like their own in a way it never had before. It was a place they had defended, a place for which they had both bled. In their own ways, they spent the rest of the day in a quiet rhythm of repair. They cleared debris from the yard, assessed the damage to the stable, and secured the goats in a temporary pen. They spoke little, their communication a seamless flow of shared tasks. Rosie, quiet and watchful, helped by gathering stray pieces of wood and feeding the chickens. Her presence a small, steady flame of the future they had rescued. As the sun began to dip below the western mesas, painting the sky in soft hues of rose and gold, Ethan put down his hammer. He looked at Eliza, who was coiling a length of rope, her movements tired but graceful. "Come," he said, "there is something I want you to see." He led her not toward the house, but up the gentle slope of the hill behind it, through the stand of whispering pines. They climbed until they reached a small, flat promontory that overlooked the entire valley. From here, they could see their small homestead nestled below, a bastion of resilience. They could see the path of the flood, already beginning to recede, leaving behind a dark, fertile scar on the land. In the distance, a ribbon of silver glittered in the last light. The flood had changed the course of the small, seasonal creek, and now it flowed steadily, a promise of life where there had been only dry rock. They stood together, watching the last of the sun's fire fade from the sky. The world grew quiet. The only sounds, the sigh of the wind through the pines and the distant murmur of the new stream. Ethan turned to her. In the soft twilight, the hard lines of his face seemed to soften. He was not a man of easy words, and she could see the effort it took for him to gather them now. He did not kneel. Such a gesture would have felt false between them, a performance of a ritual that was not their own. Instead, he simply stood before her, an equal, and held out his hand. In his calloused palm lay a small, dark circle. It was a ring, a simple band of twisted steel, still showing the faint marks of a hammer and the heat of the forge. It was not polished or ornate. It was strong, imperfect, and beautiful. He had made it himself. "When I first saw you in that square," he began, his voice low and steady, "I saw my sister's ghost. I saw a wrong that needed righting." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "But I do not see her anymore. Eliza, I see you. I see a woman who is stronger than she knows, who is braver than anyone I have ever met. I see the woman I want to build a life with, here, in this valley." He took a breath, and his next words were the foundation of everything. "I am asking because I want to, not because you owe me. The choice is yours. It will always be yours." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of a profound, soul-deep relief for her entire life. Choices had been made for her. She had been defined by others: orphan, servant, sinner. Now, this man, who had seen her at her most broken, was offering her not a debt to be repaid, but a future to be chosen. She did not need to hesitate. The answer was already in her heart, as solid and real as the ground beneath her feet. "Yes," she whispered. It was the easiest word she had ever spoken. He took her hand, his touch gentle, and slid the cool steel ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. It was not a claim or a brand, but an anchor, a promise. Their wedding took place 3 days later, not in the cold, judgmental church of Dust Haven, but in an open meadow east of the homestead, where the wild grasses grew tall and the sky was their only roof. There was no pastor to drone on about duty and submission, no crowd to watch and whisper. There was only the vast, silent witness of the land. Their only guests were Tom Avery and Rosie Quinn. Tom stood as a friend, his presence a quiet apology for his past weakness and a testament to his newfound resolve. Rosie, in a clean, mended dress, held a small, tight bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself. She looked at Eliza with an expression of pure adoration. Ethan and Eliza stood facing each other as the midday sun warmed their shoulders. They had not written vows, for their promises to each other had already been made. In shared labor and silent understanding, in the heart of a storm and the face of a fire. Ethan took her hands in his. "I do not promise a perfect life," he said, his voice carrying on the gentle breeze. "This land is hard, and people can be cruel, but I promise you this. You will not be alone again. I will stand with you, I will listen to you, and I will honor the choices you make." Eliza looked into his eyes, and she saw her future, clear and steady. "I do not promise to be a meek or an easy wife," she replied, a small smile touching her lips. "I promise to work beside you, to speak the truth, and to build a home here that is worthy of the kindness you have shown me. I promise I will not be afraid." They exchanged no rings, for the one she already wore was enough. He leaned in and kissed her, a simple, chaste kiss that sealed their words. Tom Avery clapped, a single, sharp sound in the quiet meadow, and Rosie threw her wildflowers into the air, a small, colorful explosion of joy. That night, they sat before the hearth in the small cabin. A fire crackled, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. Outside, the world was vast and dark, but inside, there was only peace. The small house, once just his solitary shelter, now felt like a home. Rosie was asleep in the small room, a temporary and cherished ward until Tom could arrange for her to live with a decent family in a neighboring town. Ethan reached across the small space between their chairs and took Eliza's hand. He ran his thumb over the steel ring on her finger. She did not pull away. The trembling that had lived in her for so long was finally gone. He rose and pulled her gently to her feet. He led her to the bearskin rug before the fire, and they sat, the warmth of the flames on their faces. He did not speak, But his eyes told her everything. He saw her, the woman she was, not the woman the world had tried to make her. He leaned in, and his lips met hers again. This kiss was different from the one in the meadow. It was not a public seal, but a private discovery. It was slow and gentle and full of a quiet reverence. It spoke of comfort, of safety, of a loneliness that had finally come to an end for them both. It was the touch of a man who was not taking, but giving. It was the response of a woman who was not submitting, but choosing. In the soft, flickering light of the fire, surrounded by the quiet walls of their home, they began to heal. The next morning, Eliza found Ethan outside, working a piece of smooth, weathered pine with a carving knife. He was carefully etching letters into the wood. She watched him for a while, his hands so strong and sure, creating something new. When he was finished, he showed it to her. He had carved a new sign for their homestead. The letters were deep and plain, filled with a mixture of charcoal and pitch to make them stand out. It did not say simply Cole Homestead. It read, Cole Homestead Ethan, Eliza, and Hope. The seasons turned over the valley, each one a quiet confirmation of their new life. The harsh sun of that summer gave way to a crisp autumn that painted the scrubland in shades of rust and gold. Winter followed, blanketing the homestead in a soft, clean layer of snow, silencing the world and drawing them closer to the warmth of their hearth. And then came spring, a season of astonishing rebirth. The creek, which had been born in the violence of the flood, now ran clear and steady, and the valley floor, once scoured to mud, was covered in a carpet of impossible green and dotted with wildflowers. The sign they had made stood at the entrance to their lane, the wood weathered to a soft gray, the letters dark and certain. Hope was no longer just a word on a sign. It was the air they breathed, the foundation of the life they were building together. The stable was rebuilt, stronger than before. The hay barn was restocked. The rhythm of their days was marked by hard work, shared meals, and a quiet, steadfast companionship that was more precious than any spoken poetry. But for Eliza, the peace she had found for herself was not quite enough. Her own healing felt incomplete until she could offer a similar sanctuary to others. The dream she had carried in her heart for so long, the one that had seemed like a foolish fantasy, began to take shape. She wanted to teach. She found an old, abandoned warehouse at the edge of Dust Haven, its windows boarded up and its roof sagging. It had belonged to a freight company that went bust years ago. To most, it was an eyesore. To Eliza, it was a promise. With Ethan's help, working side by side, they transformed it. They patched the roof, replaced the broken floorboards, and set glass in the window frames, letting the light pour in. They built small wooden desks from salvaged timber and painted a large section of the wall with black paint to serve as a chalkboard. Above the door, Eliza hung a simple, hand-painted sign that read, in neat, clear letters, Hope's Corner. It was her declaration to the world that hope was not a grand, abstract concept, but a small, determined thing that could be built in a dusty corner of a forgotten town. Her first students were the children no one else had time for, the children of poor ranchers, the quiet, overlooked daughters of shopkeepers, and a handful of orphans who lived in the back rooms of the church, cared for but not truly seen. The town itself was changing, healing from the inside out. Jasper Crow, his authority shattered, had packed his bags and left in the middle of the night, unable to face the town he had once ruled with an iron fist. Wade Merrick had been taken by a federal marshal to Santa Fe, his fate to be decided by a judge and jury far from the influence of his family's name. Tom Avery had turned in his deputy's badge. He found he could serve the cause of justice better without it. He took a job as a trail guard for the stagecoach line, a position that suited his quiet, watchful nature. He was freer under the open sky than he ever had been in the confines of the town's law. He would often stop by the homestead on his rides, sharing a cup of coffee and news from the wider territory, his face relaxed and at peace. Even Mercy Pike had found a new calling. The fire of her moral certainty had been banked, replaced by the quiet, steady warmth of genuine compassion. She had organized a soup kitchen in a small room behind the church, offering a hot meal to any traveler or down on their luck soul who passed through Dust Haven. She and Eliza never spoke of the past, but when their eyes met across the square, there was a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding that redemption was found not in judgment, but in service. One afternoon, as Eliza was walking her small group of students home, their path took them through the center of the town square. A small group of men were gathered in the corner, near where she had once been bound. They had ropes and crowbars, and they were working to take down the old shaming post. The flood had loosened its foundation, and the town council, now made up of more reasonable men, had decided it was a relic of a past they were eager to forget. With a great groan of protesting wood, the post toppled to the ground. It lay there in the dust, thick and gray and stripped of all its terrible power. "What should we do with it?" one of the men asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "Burn it, I suppose." Eliza, holding the hand of a small, shy girl, stepped forward. "If you are just going to burn it," she said, her voice clear and steady, "we could use the firewood at the school. The mornings are still cold." The man looked at her, then at the fallen post, and a slow smile spread across his face. He understood. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I think that is the best use for it." The next day, the wood that had been an instrument of her greatest shame was stacked neatly beside the schoolhouse, ready to be transformed into warmth and light. The final scene unfolded on an afternoon bathed in the soft, golden light of late spring. The school day was over, and the cheerful sounds of children heading home had faded away. Only one student remained, a little girl named Sarah, an orphan who had arrived in town on a wagon a month before, clutching a bundle of rags and a fierce, silent mistrust of the world. Eliza sat beside her on a small wooden bench outside the schoolhouse door. They had been practicing letters, and Sarah was struggling with a particular word Eliza had written on a small slate. The girl's brow was furrowed in concentration, her small finger tracing the chalk lines. The wind, no longer carrying the biting grit of the high desert, was a gentle caress, rustling the new leaves on the cottonwood trees. The dust of Dust Haven had settled. From the far end of the street, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer was a sound of industry, not of tension. "But, Sarah whispered, sounding out the letters. Eliza pointed to the middle of the word. "This part makes an E sound," she said softly. "But, leave," the girl finally managed, her eyes widening as the collection of shapes resolved into a word she understood. Believe. She looked up at Eliza, a rare, brilliant smile illuminating her small, serious face. Eliza smiled back, her heart full. She squeezed the girl's small hand. In that moment, she was not just teaching a child to read, she was passing on the most important lesson she had ever learned. From a distance, down the long, quiet street, a clear, sharp whistle cut through the air. It was Ethan, calling for his horse at the livery. It was the sound of home, the sound of a good man finishing a day's work, the sound of a life that was solid and true, and theirs. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the square, and its golden light fell on the new glass in the schoolhouse window, on the earnest, upturned face of a child learning to believe, and on the quiet, steady hands of the woman who had taught her. The light was gentle, and it illuminated all the things that had been broken, and all the things that had been healed. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment below with where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like this video, and press that hype button to help share this story with even more people.